Hello there. Welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. This is of course a show where we dive into weird, unusual albums of, all sorts and whatnot, right? And so you might have noticed we've got a black and white episode today. And that's because, this is an incredibly monochrome and grey album that we're discussing today. I mean, it's one that I feel is just completely devoid of colour. And instead of ascending to these incredibly cathartic highs, it just instead stays below the murky depths, wallowing in negative moods and self-pity, I would say this is without a doubt one of my favourite releases of this year, because I just love how it perfectly expresses this, negativity in a sense. So today, of course, I present the wonderful Tim Hecker and his 2023 album, No Highs. So, before we dive into this album, let's of course ask the question, who is Tim Hecker? Well, Tim Hecker is a Canadian electronic musician, producer, composer and sound artist whose music can be described as ambient, without a doubt probably. But it's the kind that has much more angular edges to it, in my opinion. It's this incredibly intense and almost visceral experience you get when listening to Hecker albums, and it makes it so absurdly interesting as a result, especially in comparison to the monotonous, boring ambient music you often get that's just all the same essentially. And so across his career, Hecker has released an absurd number of albums, I would say, releasing them on such labels as Alien 8, Kranky, Fat Cat, even 4AD for the 2016 album Love Streams. And on top of this, Hecker has collaborated with so many artists, and also has an extensive list of remixes for various bands, including the likes of Isis, Colin Stetson, Interpol, Ben Frost, and even Mogwai. And so, today we're looking at what is, at this point in time, his latest album, the phenomenal No Highs. 51 minutes of anti-chill out drones and tones that, according to the liner notes, serves as a beacon of unease against the deluge of false positive corporate ambience currently in vogue. And so this is ambient, sure enough, but it is ambient music that is profoundly and existentially intertwined into feelings of anxiety, isolation, depression, I would argue even detachment as well, to be fair, but maybe that just comes hand in hand with depression, my experience anyway. It's perhaps one of Hecker's more challenging albums, I would say, as there's incredibly little respite across the whole album experience, as it just completely drowns you in these negative moods, essentially. It should be mentioned as well, though, that Tim Hecker is joined by a number of guests who appear and perform in the album, of course. To begin with, we have one Victor Alaba on bass clarinet, Pietro Amato on French horn, Joe Grass on pedal steel guitar, and of course, the one and only Colin Stetson performing saxophone, of course, right? And so it all culminates into such a truly fascinating album experience where Hecker's, dense, visceral electronic layers accompanied by the most unusual and at times briefest instrumental passages from the guests, all helping to elevate that level of anxiety and uncertainty. So let's just dive into it then, shall we? So No Highs, it opens up with this phenomenal monotony. 8-minute excursion of repeated notes flickering away as this deluge of noise and low end occupy the scene, dragging the entire composition to this anxiety-inducing landscape. My favourite part of this composition, though, is the pitch shifting of certain keys that just, it starts up here, and then it gets dragged down by the spectral beings into the undergrowth beneath. And I think there's something so satisfying about hearing that, and it expresses this really weird sort of detuned detachment to the world around us, I feel. It's very interesting, I think. how I feel about it. Like, it just expresses that to me when I hear it, essentially. But as well, though, there's some lovely, like, acoustic layers that also flow into the scene, and most likely from the various wind instruments, provided by all the guest musicians here, of course. And I'd say it's kind of hard to discern who it is at times, what exactly we're hearing. Is it the saxophone, is it the bass clarinet, etc., etc. But regardless, all of these particular layers, they just create so much uncomfortable tension to the already anxiety-inducing scene. And I think Monotony, it just comes across as a perfect album opener that feels so quintessentially Tim Hecker at times, but it's kind of a departure as well to what we should be used to from the guy, considering that it's weird. It's always minimalist at times as well. I'd feel like it's much more held back and restrained instead of just ascending forward. It's just like much more restrained in a weird way. And it feels like everything you're hearing, it's all very carefully positioned and controlled, especially whenever a new sound source enters the scene. And it just all results in such a tumultuous album experience that never climbs to these incredible bombastic crescendos, but rather it continues to just lie in the murky depths below. And so get used to it, because this whole album is going to continue in the same fashion to absurdly great effect, I feel. And so we move on to track 2, Glysalia. 3 minutes of what I assume is cathedral keys, at least cathedral keys have been mentioned in the liner notes, accompanied once again by the peculiar sound of the wind instruments. And I cannot discern exactly who of the guests it is, of course. It could be all of them, it could just be one of them. At first I thought it was Colin Stetson, but who knows. But what I love in this one is the unusual sound of breathing and air just passing through the instrument itself, that create these really unusual musical layers. And it turns the instruments themselves into these sort of living, breathing entities that are, it's like they're almost existentially panicking away amongst the turmoil that this album is presenting. And as well, once again, something kind of restrained and held back about it. Even as those keys, they intertwine and confuse themselves amongst this incredible noise. There's something so ominous about that, and something that really inspires this level of tension and uncertainty, which of course is the very point of the album. It's very interesting. Of course, we get track 3 though, Total Garbage, and this is a short little number featuring very dense, heavy layers that's incredibly satisfying to listen to, of course. And although it's short, there is a lot of turmoil coming across on this one, which is perhaps exasperated by the guest instruments. But what I think is interesting is there's the really heavy keys from Hecker here. It's almost establishing a beat of sorts, but the pop composition just becomes so formless. It's just traveling along with no real direction towards anything, and instead just lingering and intertwining amongst itself so brilliantly amongst these really just dense, heavy, grumpy moods, essentially. It's a short little excursion, but one that's continuing this this arduous journey, of course. And of course it leads into track 4, Lotus Light. And so I would say this is perhaps an absolute highlight of the album for me. I'll say here, when No Highs was first announced, essentially, this was the accompanying single to introduce us to the new soundscape from Tim Hecker, and I remember immediately listening to it when it was first announced and just being pulled into that incredibly ominous, bleak atmosphere the whole thing was offering up. And opening up with these really unsettling repeated notes, so dun 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 dun, you just get this really distressing constant pulse accompanied by the most unusual droning layers that once again get detuned so brilliantly on this one. And I don't know why, but from when I first heard it to hearing it now still, and every time I listen to it, I just love hearing those notes just get detuned down the pitch and just going. It just, I don't know why, but I got really obsessed with that little motif when I first heard this song, to the point where I would just keep imitating it to the rest of the band at our band practices, because I just love that descent it does though. It's just being stretched and pulled into this really just anxiety-inducing way, if that makes sense. But of course, there's so much more to the song. Like, it's brilliant as it travels towards the second half, I would say, where you're just getting this deluge of droning layers climbing all over each other, you know. And it's kind of unusual. I feel like this one, you know, it kind of feels like being pulled out of space and time, you know, and just observing disastrous effects with a sort of nonchalance, a sort of not caring attitude towards it, as though what is happening regardless, and there's essentially nothing we can do about it, so as a result we're just kind of disconnected from the entire experience. And to go into that a bit more, I find it unusual and weird, the whole disconnecting elements of this, you know, this very album essentially, and it's weird because it really communicates itself to me in such an unusual way for some reason, and I'm not sure if it's an intended theme of this album, but it's just what comes across to me every time I hear it though. And you know, as you said, there's this constant negative mood that just gets played around with so brilliantly as across the whole album experience though, and it makes it, for me, one of the most engrossing and fascinating Tim Hecker albums as a result though. You know, this underlying tension and anxiety it's never relieved, but rather it just gets exasperated at times, just explored in this really unusual yet fascinating and existential way. But moving along, we get to track 5, Winter Cop, and which after, you know, the incredibly tense opening of Monotony all the way up to Lotus Light, I feel like this is perhaps the only moment of respite we get on the entire album, essentially. It's a short little, you know, you're getting these much warmer ambient layers, which is kind of unusual given what we've been hearing, and you know, weirdly enough, it kind of reminds me of the vaporwave scene. I don't know why, but especially the mall soft stuff and stuff like that, if that makes sense, you know. And I think, you know, and with Tim Hecker, you know, according to the liner notes, being a beacon of unease against the deluge of false positive corporate ambient, I can't help but wonder if there's perhaps a tongue-in-cheek element to this particular track, you know. Perhaps it being a nod to that very false positive corporate ambience that Hecker is fighting against with his, you know, expression of abstract music, essentially. And you know, considering as well that this track is kind of sandwiched between these two big massive slabs of depressing grey tones, like, it kind of makes sense to me that that's why this particular track is here on the album and such. I might be wrong, truth be told, it's all just, you know, interpretation and stuff, but it's just how this particular track comes across to me, essentially. But moving along though, we the next track, In Your Mind, introduces us back to the stuttering repetition of piano chords and notes from Hecker, you know, creating this another anxious pulse as we get these absurdly wonderful modal saxophone performances from Stetson. At least I would assume this is one of Stetson's performances. I don't know for sure because it's hard to find the actual credits for the songs and stuff, but it definitely reminds me of such. But regardless, what I like is in the background, there's this whising sort of wub sound, you know, of low end, and it kind of feels like your heart just accelerating in an attack of anxiety as we struggle to comprehend our surroundings, and instead we just get completely locked inside our very heads as we overthink the simplest things, you know, and just the darkness, the void just takes over entirely. But the ending is lovely on this one. You know, amongst those droning layers, you get this wonderful descending low-end notes, and they sound so intimidating, as though there's a sense of realization that's befallen us in the most terrifying manner possible. And it's a very intimidating track that just leads perfectly into the next track, which is a reprise of Monotony titled Monotony 2. And so here we have a repeating of those, those repeated piano notes from that open up the very album itself, you know, accompanied this time by a much clearer presence of Stetson's saxophone, which in of itself is accompanied by the very clicks on the actual keys of the saxophone instrument. You know? And so those who know of Stetson's music, you know very well that his music utilizes every single aspect of the saxophone as an instrument, you know. Not just the big drones you can get from it, but even the very clicking and tapping upon the very keys, which in his own music, it creates these very unusual beats of sorts, it's kind of a kind of rhythm, and it's very unusual. And, it's interesting though, because his specific, approach to saxophone, it's something truly unique, I feel. And it works to great effect on this particular album, though, where it's being intertwined with Hecker's, dark, moody electronic layers, Hecker's nervous quavering of piano notes, and the culmination of it all just results in something that's so tense and uncomfortable, I feel, as though the very instruments are threatening to fall apart under the weight of everything being experienced, and man, it's so intimidating, but there's something so brilliant about it, I feel. And so the entire album is just building and building and building in this weird way, and it feels like we're just ending up at what's going to be an incredibly tumultuous ending that comes in the form of the following tracks here. And this begins with Pulse Depression, which is a short little drone that slowly develops into this terrifying low-end murmuring, accompanied by the consistent pulse that just raises those anxiety levels again. And again, this one reminds me of that rather detached and almost empty feeling a lot of this album evokes for me, which is why I think it's truly fascinating, to be fair. When hearing Pulse Depression, I'm kind of reminded of those moments of depressive stasis where you just feel yourself falling back into the recesses of your own mind as the depression takes over in such a terrifying way, just, clouding your thoughts with this miasma of darkness, essentially. And as a result, it's another track that really expresses a sense of existentialism. And I find the ending very interesting, as the drones, they kind of just trail off before you're greeted with the stuttering notes of the next track, Anxiety. And this is the last long composition we have on this album, a wonderful culmination of just about everything we've been experiencing on this very album, You've got, once again, piano notes repeating ad nauseum, creating a pulse, bum, 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 as you get those brief droning layers in the background, of course. And then, once again, pitch shifting, affecting it, but it's being affected in a much more uncomfortable way than on the previous tracks, though. And as it all just progresses, that pulse is rising and ebbing, and it's very uncomfortable as a result, though. And so I feel like this one, is calling back to so many of the little motifs being established on the whole album of No Highs, but rather than just calling back to it, it's kind of presenting it, at least in my opinion, in a much more empty way, as though there's something so much more hollow and distant about it, as though we can't even connect to it in any way, shape or form anymore. And all that's left is this continuing experience of rising anxiety that offers no respite. And even when the drones just try and rise up to guide the track towards something maybe more hopeful, it instead just falls back into the recesses of everything, much more comfortable to wallow in self-pity amongst the undertow. And it feels as though the more this one progresses, the more that anxiety is rising and rising, but there's nothing to soothe it, basically. And I think, there's something so weird and unusual about that. But I find it really fascinating on some level, the representation of incredibly tumultuous and arduous emotions that the entire album is presenting, essentially. And I feel like it's been expressed so clearly in a weird way. It just makes it one of my favourite Tim Hecker albums as a result, if not my top favourite Tim Hecker album now, which is very weird, to be fair. And so the album's not over yet, though. We arrive at the penultimate track, Sense Suppression, which is incidentally the shortest track on the album, clocking it at just over 2 minutes. And, you're getting these lovely intertwining droning layers, and peculiar little instrumental motifs that come in from all angles, but they're kind of contorted and twisted in a way. And I like how the flow in the background of these rising low-end drone, it pushes it all along, making it a rather satisfying track to listen to. But all the while, it's incredibly confused, as these abstract instrumentals feel very formless at this point, almost like the sense of what I are being suppressed, essentially. And I'm pretty sure the presence of the steel pedal guitar, the pedal steel guitar, it's a lot more prominent on this one at certain moments, like hidden within the mix though. And I think it's interesting because it leads up to the finale in a very interesting way, especially when you get that seamless transition into Living Spa Water, which is perhaps the most unusual track on this album, and it's a very interesting way to end your album with this particular track though, like especially with the thematic structuring of the album, going from monotony to depression to anxiety, just going through this really arduous journey, and then you get Living Spa Water, which sounds like just therapy and healing and stuff, living like going exactly where you need to be to relax and stuff. And we'll go into that in a bit though. It's interesting because you kind of get this instrumental layer that sounds like gentle acoustic spa music, which I'm pretty sure is the pedal steel guitar again, just plucking away at a few notes. But it feels like it's been just ever so subtly twisted and bent to this really uncomfortable place that makes it just seem really off as a result. And as a whole, there's some really uncanny valley element to the entire composition, suggested more so by that continuing pulse of droning layers, that it kind of makes you feel like you're floating in the water itself, but you're getting no recovery from it though. It's like you're going through the motions of therapy and healing without getting any of that benefit from it. It's not revitalizing you. You just still feel cold, empty, isolated, and lonely, and nothing's helping. And even when, you get this rising drone towards the end of the composition, it still hasn't led towards anything. You find yourself in the exact same space and time that you've been occupying for this entire album, it seems. And so, with that, we've essentially covered No Highs by Tim Hecker, which is, I think, to be fair, it's one of those albums that I think just gets better and better every time I listen to it, though. There's no doubt an incredibly bleak and uncomfortable atmosphere permeating through the entire album experience, that it just takes a hold of negative moods and it wallows within them for like 50 minutes. And to be fair, I've always found Hecker's music to be incredibly dark and bleak for the most part, often usually to express very moody, depressing notions, it seems. Especially, when it comes to that rather intense, tumultuous style he has, where it gets very sort of like overwhelming. But listening to No Highs, though, it seems that Hecker has lent heavily on such notions, though, pushing out a very consistent album experience that to me perfectly represents those negative moods through the expression of abstract music, without really overloading it, if that makes sense, And, just to mention it briefly, I think like the actual particulars of the instruments, like what we're hearing in each of the tracks, I really adore it for some reason, from the use of repetition to drones to, of course, the guest musician, the wonderful Colin Stetson, whose modal saxophone adds so much to the overall experience. It just results in this really moody, grumpy album experience that I would say is, without a doubt, one of my favourite album releases of this year, as well as one of my favourite albums from Tim Hecker as well. And so, yeah, I think with that we're going to come to the end of today's episode of Weird Music. With the end of the year looming ahead at this point, I seem to be in this mood to want to just get a bunch of videos out discussing some of my favourite albums of this year. I might do a list towards the end of the year, to be fair, but we'll see. And I'll be honest, I'm not 100% why, but I think this might be the most I've resonated with the Tim Hecker album. And it might just not be my top. It might not be a top favourite of many people, to be fair. It doesn't seem to be, but it really resonated with me on this weird existential level, and I think it might be one of my top favourites amongst his works, alongside Rave Death 1972, which was always my go-to Tim Hecker album. It's just, No Highs is just such a grumpy, moody, anxiety-inducing excursion that does exactly what it says on the cover, to be fair, offering no highs whatsoever. Just wallowing in negativity, a complete monochrome setting of miserable greys with no colour inside. I think it's an astounding album, and maybe one of the best of this year in my opinion. And so yeah, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music, and I wish you all the best, take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.